On May 2, 1934, a group of 9 European climbers and 35 porters decided to head out on an expedition to the Nanga Parbat mountain and attempt to reach its summit. The men were all highly experienced climbers and scientists who had achieved various climbing feats. Even the porters hired to transport their supplies were well trained in mountain climbing and had gone on several Himalayan expeditions. The porters, mostly local to the mountainous regions, were accustomed to the difficult terrain, weather patterns, and potential hazards. The group was headed by 33-year-old Willy Merkl, a German mountain climber who had initially attempted the feat in 1932. Merkl's 1932 team was beaten back due to poor planning and unreliable porters who stole their supplies, but Merkl never gave up. In 1934, just 2 years after his first summit attempt, he assembled another team. This team, especially the porters, were a significant upgrade from the last ones. They were experienced, better prepared, and well-financed. His previous attempt in 1932 had suffered a number of setbacks, mostly because of lack of finance and poor planning. But this time, the expedition was fully backed by the German government. However, they had no idea of the disaster that awaited them. You see, Nanga Parbat is not one single rock from base to top. It consists of a series of 20 kilometers long rock ridges and gigantic glaciers that culminate at a main summit of 8,126 meters, making it the 9th highest mountain in the world and one of the 14 mountains higher than 8,000 meters. The glaciers are marked with deep, dangerous crevasses, and the weather here is extremely cold with little vegetation. The mountain has 3 main faces. The Rupel or south face, said to be the highest mountain face in the world at 15,000 feet, or 4,600 meters, from base to summit. Next is the Diamir or west face, and third is the Rakiot or north face. The men assembled at Srinagar, and from there they started the 200-mile or 322 kilometers trek towards the foot of the mountain where they would set up the base camp. Joining them were 600 local coolies, hired to carry 570 equipment that they would need. It was a long, cold journey with lots of snow, harsh wind, and an increasingly arduous landscape. As they went higher, the terrain became too difficult for the coolies who were almost at the verge of collapsing. You see, climbing a mountain like Nanga Parbat requires extreme physical and mental preparedness. The weather conditions up the mountain are harsher than what you would expect, and navigating your way around the slippery slopes alone requires a great deal of knowledge and experience. Because of the steepness of the mountain, only a convoy of men and sometimes animals are capable of transporting the supplies needed to traverse the difficult terrain. 17 days after they left Srinagar, the men finally got to Fairy Tale Meadow and established their base camp at 3,962 meters, or 13,000 feet, from the foot of Nanga Parbat. As the transport party carrying their supplies continued to arrive, a group of climbers known as the Advanced Party began the first assault on the mountain on the 27th of May. That was 25 days after they left Srinagar. The Advanced Party consisted of 4 experienced climbers and 16 porters with a mission to find a way through the gigantic Rakiot Glacier and establish the first few camps needed for the summit push. They would navigate through gigantic ice towers and deep crevasses to locate their camps in strategic points that would make the traversal less dangerous. Thankfully, they were favored by clear sunny skies and excellent weather conditions, and they made rapid progress finding the best spot for the next campsite. Camp 2 was eventually established at 5,350 meters, or 17,566 feet, and Camp 3 was set up a few meters above. Over the next few days, the group continued to advance through the icy slopes, and porters in turn worked tirelessly to get the food and other supplies up. But the higher they went, the lower the air pressure around them. The men now slowly had to acclimatize with the thinning air and low atmospheric pressure. One of the climbers, Alfred Drexel, soon suffered from altitude sickness in Camp 3. The men decided to take him down to base camp, but by the time he got to Camp 2, his condition had terribly worsened with violent headaches. The men sent a message to base camp, requesting the team doctor to ascend to Camp 2, but by the time he and the oxygen needed got to Camp 2, it was too late. Drexel died of lung inflammation in the arms of his comrades at around 9 p.m. on the 8th of June. Following Drexel's death, climbing was paused to honor the dead and give him a befitting burial. His body was laid to rest in a grave just a few feet above base camp. The solemn funeral was a rude reawakening as to the journey ahead. The fallen man's death couldn't be in vain either, so they renewed their determination to conquer the mountain. The porters had also proven that they were absolutely reliable. One of them, in an effort to save Drexel's life, had accomplished the work of 3 to 4 days within 24 hours. After the funeral, the team started preparing to move back to Camp 3 and continue the mission. But a messenger came with news that their supplies had been delayed due to a snowstorm on the Burzel Pass. They couldn't advance without these supplies because amongst them were ground barley, an indispensable food they would need for the higher regions. The assault, which started aggressively, had now been slowed down first by Drexel's death and now the wait for supplies. This in turn caused them to lose precious days of fine weather. But they had no idea how much these delays would affect their journey later. You see, the climatic condition around a mountain like Nanga Parbat is very unpredictable. The mountain is located in a region where the climate is harsh, and because of its altitude, weather conditions around the mountain often differ from base to summit, especially during the winter seasons. It could literally go from clear sunny skies to fierce snowstorms in an instant. At last, they started moving on the 22nd of June, and by the end of June, Camp 4 was established as the advanced base camp at 6,185 meters, or 20,307 feet. At this point, they only had about 6,000 feet to go, but this was where things started to get a little tricky. First, the route Merkl had marked earlier in 1932 was now impassable due to rocky glaciers and was now an avalanche-prone area. Some of the men proposed climbing over the Rakiot Peak to set up Camp 5, but they soon realized that it would be impossible for the laden porters to climb the slippery slopes without assistance. They eventually agreed to set up Camp 5 near the foot of the Rakiot Peak. At 6,690 meters or 21,965 feet, Camp 5 was only about 500 meters away from Camp 4, but the site was perfect and gave the men enough rest time before the assault over Rakiot Peak. Unfortunately, one of the porters fell ill at Camp 5 and was sent back to Camp 4. On the 2nd of July, the team began the challenging climb over Rakiot Peak. Now, about 6,000 meters from the base of the mountain, the route was dangerously steep and slippery, and the men had to cut steps and fix ropes into the icy walls for the porters to safely ascend and descend with. Such work at a height of 22,300 feet was extremely dangerous and tiring, and by the time they completed the upper half of the ice wall, the men were completely exhausted and barely made it back to Camp 5. The next day, which was the 4th of July, Merkl assembled the team before the final push. After 2 months of hard work, they were now only about 2,000 meters away from reaching the summit. The climb over Rakiot Peak was especially difficult for the laden porters. Most of them had never been on an ice wall so steep. After hours of climbing, the men finally established Camp 6 at 6,955 meters, or 22,835 feet, near a sharp snow ridge that led towards Silver Saddle. This was where Merkl's previous 1932 expedition had gotten before turning back. As they set up camp, the men could see the beauty of Nanga Parbat in all its glory, and were more confident that they would reach the summit in the next 3 to 4 days. That night, in spite of the cramped position in the tent, the men slept happily and pleased with their journey so far. But the next morning, 3 porters fell sick due to altitude sickness and were sent back to Camp 5. The men continued the assault and set up Camp 7 at 7,105 meters, or 23,328 feet, just below the last steep slope of the Silver Saddle. They were now only 1,000 meters away from the death zone. You see, the death zone is at an altitude of 8,000 meters with reduced atmospheric pressure. The air is so thin up there that it's difficult for humans to breathe. And when this happens, your heart is unable to get the oxygen it needs to keep your body supplied. This causes blood to pool into the lungs, causing pulmonary edema, or high-altitude cerebral edema, HACE. The men's strides were getting shorter, and their pauses for breath in between was longer. Oxygen level at this point was low, and on the morning of July 6th, 2 more porters fell ill at Camp 7. They were in fact completely exhausted and had to be escorted down the slippery slopes. On their way down, the climber who escorted the sick men noticed something interesting. A thick fog had enveloped Camp 5 all the way down, and as they got closer to it, he realized it was a heavy storm. Meanwhile, the weather above Camp 5 was sunny and the skies were clear. When he and the 2 porters got to Camp 4, he was told that the storm had been raging down there for days. This was surprising to the escort because the weather in Camp 7 above was clear and sunny, and there was no indication of a storm brewing. He was even more convinced that with the weather up there, the men would reach the summit the following day. Back in Camp 7, the men continued to advance until they got to Silver Saddle at 7,451 meters, or 24,464 feet. The team was now down to 5 climbers and 11 porters. At this height, it was getting increasingly difficult to breathe, and the men were now exhausted. But they pressed on and eventually set up Camp 8 at 7,700 meters, or 25,280 feet. Now, face to face with the summit, the men estimated their climb to the summit to be about 4 to 5 hours, and slept that night dreaming about their final summit push. Unfortunately for them that night, the storm back in Camp 5 reached the men above, and this time, it had become a raging hurricane. The wind blasted throughout the mountain, wildly shaking the men's tent and almost bending it completely. The men remained inside their tents, hopeful that the weather would let down the following morning. But morning came, and the storm only grew stronger. The men had to give up their dreams of a summit push and remain in their tents. And even though they were warmer and safer in their tents, the terrible storm prevented them from cooking any hot food. They had enough provisions to last them 5 days, but as the wind continued to forcefully blast against their tents, they knew that it was dangerous to hope for any improvement in the weather. Weather conditions atop mountains like these are unpredictable, and waiting it out would be a suicide mission. If the storm continued to rage like this, they still wouldn't be able to cook hot food and would slowly freeze to death. If they were going to survive this, they had to make a descent back to safety. But imagine trying to climb up down a slippery slope with high-velocity winds battering you from all sides. The following day, now July 8th, Merkl instructed everyone to head back to Camp 4. The men were divided into 2 groups. Group A, which consisted of 2 climbers and 3 porters, would make the descent first, while the remaining 11 men led by Merkl would follow shortly after. But the journey down the slopes was much tougher than they expected. It was extremely cold outside with low visibility, and the forceful winds hit them from all sides. The snowstorm had covered most of their previous tracks, and they had to make new ones. As Group A climbed down, one of the climbers cautiously led the way. The laden porters were in the middle, and the second climber followed closely behind, ready to catch anyone from falling and dragging the whole team to their deaths. The raging snowstorm made it difficult for the men to see more than 10 feet from themselves, and this caused them to make several false and exhausting detours that made the descent even longer. Later that day, the men unroped themselves, and the 2 climbers led the group, working together to cut new tracks and make their descent faster. That evening, the 2 climbers stumbled into Camp 4, completely exhausted and covered in ice. Their porters weren't with them, but they believed the 3 men were closely behind. Night came, and there was no sight of the porters, nor of the second group led by Merkl. What the men didn't know was that the 3 porters from Group A had lost track of them and gotten no farther than Camp 7. The other group, consisting of Merkl, 2 other climbers, and 8 porters, never even made it to Camp 7. The blinding blizzard and cold prevented them from getting any further, so they set up camp somewhere in between Camp 7 and Camp 8. But they didn't have a tent, and their secondary camp was no match for the raging blizzard. One of the porters from Merkl's group died that night as a result of the extreme cold, and 3 others woke up terribly sick. That morning, now July 9th, the 3 porters from Group A, who stayed at Camp 7, continued their journey down to Camp 6. Merkl's group also decided to continue their descent, but the sick porters were too weak to join them, so they stayed back in the secondary camp. Without the sick porters, Merkl's group was now down to 3 climbers and 4 porters who slowly made their way down. 30 meters away from the Camp 7 tent, one of the climbers slumped and died out of exhaustion. Merkl himself was too exhausted to continue the journey and sought shelter in Camp 7 with another climber. The 4 remaining porters continued the descent despite the terrible storm, but even they didn't get to Camp 6. They had to seek shelter in a snow cave in between Camp 6 and Camp 7. The men were now scattered into different groups, but still close to each other without realizing it. The following morning, now July 10th, the 3 porters from Group A and the 4 porters from Merkl's group continued the journey from their different locations and later reunited a little after Camp 6. But only 4 of the 7 managed to make it to Camp 4. 2 of the remaining 3 porters from Group A had died during the descent from Rakiat Peak, while the last one died just 3 meters away from Camp 5. The 4 men from Merkl's group who had managed to wade through the freezing snow were badly frostbitten and exhausted. On July 11th, one of the 3 sick porters who had stayed back in the secondary camp between Camp 7 and Camp 8 died. The remaining 2, now much stronger, decided to make the descent to Camp 7. There they saw Merkl and the other climber. Together, the 4 men took shelter in Camp 7, hopeful that help would soon arrive from the camps below. But the rescue team's attempts to reach the men were all in vain. They were beaten back by the storm, as it continued to rage wildly, blocking any chances of a rescue mission. Even when it seemed to let up a bit, the rescue team only succeeded in getting to Camp 5 before they were repelled back by the storm's renewed intensity. On the night of July 13th, the climber with Merkl died in Camp 7. The next morning, the last 3 survivors began to descend towards Camp 6, but Merkl was too exhausted to continue the journey, so they camped in an ice cave in between Camp 7 and Camp 6. But later that afternoon, the men in Camp 4 would see a lone figure pressing down in spite of the terrible weather. Through some superhuman strength, the man fought his way through the blazing blizzard and eventually stumbled into Camp 4, terribly weak and frostbitten. It was one of the 2 surviving porters with Merkl. He told them about Merkl's critical condition. Apparently, the other porter was still in pretty good shape and could have made the descent too, but he chose to stay with Merkl in the ice cave. For the next 2 days, the men in Camp 4 desperately tried to rescue Merkl and the other porter, Gale, but it was all in vain. The storm continued to rage. By the 17th of July, they could no longer hear any more cries for help. Merkl and his trusted companion Gale were no more. The 1934 attempt to climb the Nanga Parbat summit had claimed the lives of 10 brave men, including 4 European climbers and 6 porters,